You should go into movies blind more often. Now, real quick, fair warning, unlike my previous output on this channel so far, I'm not really going to be making too many big thematic claims about movies in this one. Instead, I just want to spend a bit of time waxing poetic about how nice it can be for a film to really take you by surprise. I hope you're down for a slightly more informal one this time around. First, let me explain what I mean by going in blind. What I'm getting at is the experience of sitting down and watching a movie while knowing as little information about it as possible. Ideally, this would be without the influence of online discourse, reviews, or even taglines and brief single-paragraph descriptions of the film. And I'll be the first one to admit to not doing this very often. I do a lot of peeking at Letterboxd reviews before watching movies. I mean, at a certain point you have to consider being economical with your time, and taking a quick look at a synopsis or a review can admittedly be a good way to get an idea as to whether or not a film is gonna be up your alley. Like, I obviously understand that you shouldn't base your opinion on a piece of art on whether or not the critics liked it. But at the same time, if the general consensus on a film is that it sucks and you shouldn't waste your time watching it, well, then that can be useful information when considering whether or not to spend your time watching it. And yet, still, I just wish I did it less often. I feel like even just skimming articles and IMDb pages before watching a movie gives a little too much away at times. I don't necessarily mean that I spoil films for myself. I don't think I'd go as far as to call the basic premise of a movie a spoiler, but still, I guess it does feel a bit like I'm missing out on some part of the experience by knowing even that little bit when going in. When you go into movies blind, it sort of lets you meet the movie, its characters, its world, on its own terms. It makes its plot beats feel more alive, the experience of consuming them more active and engaging, because in a very real way, you're letting the film call the shots. The movie is deciding what information you know and when you know it. I do feel like I need to note here, though, that watching a movie and knowing next to nothing about it is kind of a difficult thing to achieve in the first place. I mean, come on. In the course of finding a film, taking interest in it, physically accessing it, and watching it, how is one supposed to avoid even a simple plot synopsis? And beyond that, how else should we learn about new and interesting projects but through discourse and hype? Are our experiences with those films then less valuable? Well, although I do think hype can make it hard to regulate our expectations, and in turn can cause us to be disappointed with pieces of media that we might otherwise enjoy, I definitely don't think that there's anything wrong with going into a movie with expectations. I mean, I'd rather learn about the existence of interesting movies, even if that means learning a bit about their plots in the process, than run around with my head in the sand and inevitably miss out on cool stuff. So, in light of these facts, let me try to refine my framing of going in blind a little bit. That pure, untainted experience that I'm describing is more of a platonic ideal than a direct requirement. What I mean is that it's not black or white, going in purely blind versus having a tainted experience with a movie. I obviously wouldn't argue that your time with a film will be ruined just by reading its basic premise, but I would argue, generally, that the less you know before sitting down to watch a movie, the better. And yet, I still feel like we have a bit of a conundrum here. Going into movies blind feels better, at least to me, But how are we to learn about the existence of movies without learning a bit about them in the process? How do we strive toward that platonic ideal? And I think I have sort of a solution. Bear with me here. Obviously, the majority of movies we'll watch will be watched with some prior knowledge of them. We of course shouldn't outright avoid recommendations from friends, reviews from critics, and general discourse. That being said, I think there is a way to get that unadulterated experience, at least sometimes. So here's my solution. I think the best way to blind watch a movie is to make yourself blind pick a movie every once in a while. Let me give you an example of what that looks like for me. You may or may not know of the twice annual Barnes & Noble Criterion Collection sale. If you don't, basically twice a year, typically once during the summer and once during the winter, all Criterion Blu-rays and DVDs sold at Barnes & Noble drop to half off. Typically, for Blu-rays at least, from $40 to $20 a piece. And I'm sure that you can look at me and know that this twice-yearly sale is kind of a big deal for me. And every time I'm picking up movies at the Criterion sale, I always make sure to blindly pick one or two. I just look at the shelf, let a box catch my eye, and grab it without looking any harder at it. And at first glance, this might sound like a pretty risky way to pick out a new movie to watch. I mean, it could easily be terrible. And yeah, I think to a degree that's true. But in this specific situation, that fact is mitigated by one rather obnoxious factor. And that is that it's the Criterion Collection. And like it or not, despite my very human urge to feel unique, I fall quite predictably into their key demographic. I am a sort of aimless, early 20-something, admittedly kind of pretentious film major. And so, I can mostly trust that if I grab a random Blu-ray off the Criterion display, even if I don't love it, I probably won't feel like my time's been wasted. And I think that that's one helpful strategy in employing this method. Doing a bit of light research into specific distributors can give you a rough idea of what logos to look for when picking up movies. In this way, you can know who's putting out quality stuff and what genres and eras they specialize in, without having to dig too deeply into the particular movies in their catalogs. For example, if you want generically great films, art house and otherwise, from a hodgepodge of eras, with a healthy dose of pretension to boot, grab a Criterion Blu-ray. If you want a movie you'll have to read, not because it's an international film, but because it's 300 years old, grab a Kino Lorber distributed film. And if you want some always strange, sometimes schlocky horror, maybe pick up something from Arrow Video. And listen, I totally understand that a lot of people don't have the time, resources, or desire to collect physical copies of media. That is a totally sane position to find yourself in. But this method works just as well for streaming. I find HBO Max to be a good place to implement this method because they are seemingly the only streaming service to have an A to Z feature, in which you can skim in alphabetical order through their entire film catalog. And from here, the philosophy is the same. Scroll through, let something catch your eye, and just press play. So now, for more or less the rest of the video, I want to just talk about an experience I had watching a movie in this way. And I also want to touch on how I think my ignorance going in improved my overall experience with it. I chose the film that I'm going to be talking about because it's a very special one to me. One that, quite unexpectedly, uplifted me at a time when I really needed it. And that movie is Hirokazu Koreeda's Afterlife. In early 2021, I was, for a few reasons, not doing so well. I was struggling with some personal issues in my life, as well as dealing, as we all were, with that one big world event that, at the time, seemed to have no end in sight. As for the personal end of things, in early 2020, I went through what I can only describe as a nervous breakdown. And I gotta say, that's a term that really shows its precision once you've experienced it. What I mean is that after it happened, I realized that there was no other term that could so succinctly and accurately describe the event. I was nervous, and so nervous that I eventually broke down. Basically, in an instant, I went from relative normality to feeling completely detached from myself, and yet simultaneously uncomfortably aware of my surroundings. I've, for a long time, struggled to accurately describe quite what it felt like. It was like my spirit, or my consciousness, or whatever, was threatening to slip right out of my head, to escape from me, to float up into space, or to just evaporate in the night air. At the same time, the world around me looked horrifically uncanny all of a sudden. It was as if my anxiety was becoming directly, visibly externalized. I now know that this is a phenomenon called depersonalization, derealization. But at the time, I was simply convinced that I was doomed to completely lose my mind. Alright, so fast forward a year back to early 2021. It was a year that was ultimately spent indoors like everyone else. And I came to sort of a point of stability, but that feeling of detachment, of externalized terror, never really left. Each night I'd think to myself, maybe with some sleep this will go away. And every morning I'd wake up with the feeling still there. And then, during a Criterion sale, I blindly picked up Afterlife. And before I go any further, this isn't a story about a film saving me or anything like that. I progressively got better in terms of my mental health in a few ways, not least of all therapy, as well as going through the gauntlet of finding medication that worked. I don't think it's invalid to feel a piece of art has saved you or anything like that, but I do think it'd be dishonest to present this particular story that way. This is more of a story of a piece of art giving me an unexpected moment of comfort during a time when I just wasn't doing very well. So basically, Afterlife is a movie about, well, the afterlife. Or more specifically, a kind of waiting room before the afterlife. In the world of the film, regardless of how one has lived their life, when they die, they're sent to the same place as everyone else. A sort of onboarding center. In this onboarding center, newly dead people are all faced with the same task, picking one memory from their lives to take with them into the true afterlife. This process is facilitated by a team of counselors, which help talk them through their decision, while also taking detailed notes on the memory that they eventually decide upon. The reason for this note-taking is that the memories that are taken with these people are not perfect, nor are they, strictly speaking, really memories. The way these chosen moments are encapsulated is through the medium of film. The counselors in this place double as amateur filmmakers. They, under the directorial control of the newly deceased, recreate these memories on a soundstage. Then, they screen the shorts together in a theater, and as the films are shown, each person finally crosses the veil, with only that one memory to take with them. Afterlife is a gorgeous, magical, and kind-hearted piece of art. I think that kind-heartedness is really what sets it apart from other media that approaches the question of what happens to us after death. Each individual taking part in the counseling process is fully and empathetically realized by Koreeda. The counseling/interview process itself is depicted at a slow, measured pace, which immediately takes on the vibe of listening to a friend or family member reflect warmly on good times. It feels like a mug of hot chocolate or a warm hug, listening to these characters reflect bittersweetly on their lives, fumbling around as we often do for the specifics of these memories, being confident on some and not so much on others. One man, for example, recounts his experience flying a small plane above the clouds. Some parts of the memory are foggy, but he's confident that the wings of the plane sat on top of the body rather than on the sides. At first, we wonder why that detail is so important, but then it's revealed rather obviously. Were one to look out of a plane with side-mounted wings, those wings would obscure most of the view below. But if they're placed on top, that beautiful vista is unobstructed. The characters in this film are all used in that way to offer different insights about life and death and our memories. One young girl decides that her memory will be one of a class trip to Disneyland, but she ultimately decides against it and lands on a more personal one after being confronted by one of the counselors, who tells her that she is the 30th some odd schoolgirl to choose a memory from Disneyland. Another man chooses a memory of riding the bus as a child, putting specific emphasis on the heat of the vehicle being offset by a light breeze on his face from an open window. Another woman still lies about an idyllic memory which never existed, a fact which is revealed through the counselor's research when he finds historical inconsistencies in the particulars of her story. And therein lies another important element in this film. As much as it puts emphasis on the sublimeness of warmly reflecting on nice little memories, it also acknowledges the potential pain of looking back on a life not well lived. We are confronted with the existential horror of a life of regret. In fact, that possibility hangs in the background of the entire film. In this way, the film feels profoundly honest in its approach to the afterlife. It is not a heaven for good people, it is not a hell for bad people. Rather, your time in this place is proportional to your life, to the sum of experiences you've accrued in your memory. So, while the film denies us a hell to send bad people to, it might be offering us an even scarier possibility. Rather than some higher power making an objective final judgment on one's life, in afterlife, it is you who must be the judge. It is you who must deliberate over the sum of your time here on Earth and ultimately judge one single memory to take with you, to act as an embodiment of your entire life. But still, the entire film emanates such empathy and kindness as to render this existential horror at least tolerable. No one is here to scold you, or to punish you, or to judge you. Just to sit with you, to listen to you, to more or less debrief you from life. And it's just wonderful. I don't want to go too much further into it because I really do think you should seek this one out. It's one of the first films I saw that I feel I can truly call life-affirming. In a sea of movies asking dark, thoughtful questions about our existence, Afterlife ventures to offer an answer. It tells us, yes, there are deep, dark, existentially terrifying realities in this life. But there is also beauty. There is also great hope. There are wonderful, warm, fulfilling memories still to be made. You might rightly be wondering how this movie relates to my mental health at the time, or what particularly made blind watching this movie so much better than it otherwise would have been. So let me get into both of those things now. Firstly, yeah, I must admit that this film doesn't seem to directly relate that much to my situation at the time. And yet, it was still so inexplicably helpful and immediately important to me. I've wondered about it a bit myself, and I think I ultimately do know what made it feel so profound and relevant. See, my little nervous breakdown wasn't entirely unprecedented. At the time, I was 19. And like many 19-year-olds, I was grappling hard with what my role in this world was gonna be. And that's an internal journey that I'm still on today, and that I expect, to some degree, I will always be on. My head was overfilled with all of these big thoughts and questions about the world. My estimation was that life and my lot in it were terrifyingly unimportant. I was neck-deep engulfed in existential crisis, and that manifested in me constantly oscillating between extreme anxiety and a gray, aimless depression. And that feeling of being entirely lost in the universe, in its ostensible meaninglessness, was the backdrop to this breakdown. At the time, I sought out works of great philosophers to try and help myself, particularly the existentialists. I could tell that they were getting at something close to the source of my crisis, and yet Afterlife gave me my answer in a way that Camus and Sartre never seemed able to. Yes, I identified heavily with the protagonist of Nausea. I deeply related to the pain he felt simply in confronting the inexplicability of the world around him. Likewise, I understood Camus' declaration that the world, that the way we relate to each other, that the human condition in general is fundamentally absurd. But Afterlife puts it all in such simple and gentle terms. Afterlife describes its prescription for existential angst succinctly. It tells us simply to go live. Life can be scary and painful, but for your own sake, go and live it. Go and make a beautiful memory. Because in this admittedly meaningless, terrifying existence, there is still beauty and intimacy and love and kindness and a million other good things. We have the opportunity in this life at least to make memories. Warm little imperfect films to watch in our minds from time to time when things get painful. And I'm glad that I went into Afterlife blind for a couple reasons. I'm glad I didn't initially know the film's conclusion on these grand topics, because despite this being a relatively slow, chill movie, I was on the edge of my seat. I was being presented with all of these questions that I had been personally struggling with for some time, and I waited with bated breath the entire runtime to see how the film answered them. And as the pieces fell into place, as the film showed its hand, it felt again like a succession of warm hugs. I felt I was finally given some kind of advice I could work with, some kind of substantive assurance that, despite the existential horror innate in it, this life is still worth living, and there are good, magical, irreplaceable memories to be made in it. Another reason, and a much simpler one, is that had I not been open to blindly grabbing a movie off the shelf, I probably never would have watched it. If I'd instead just grabbed another movie I'd seen before, or even a movie I was familiar with but had yet to see, I would have missed out on an experience that was truly enriching to my life, and is still deeply important to me. Okay, before I wrap this video up, I'd like to say, take this all with a grain of salt. I'm just a guy talking to a camera. I don't want this video to come off as judgment or as a set of rules for how film must be consumed. There are plenty of movies that, frankly, I probably enjoyed more because of my prior knowledge of them. I mean, I personally really liked Oppenheimer, despite not being the biggest fan of Christopher Nolan's filmography to that point. But I have to wonder how much of that enjoyment was due to the fact that I listened to a 6+ hour podcast series about the Manhattan Project in the month or so leading up to the film's release. Also, we rewatch movies, so obviously that fact alone shows that there's clear merit in watching things you're already familiar with. Anyway, all I really want to do is give all of you a slight nudge. Get out of your comfort zone every once in a while, and pick a movie at random from time to time, because you might get lucky and stumble into something that you really, really love.